Good evening. I'm Sarah Watson, the Executive Director of Looking for Lincoln in the Abraham Lincoln National Heritage Area. Welcome to tonight's Looking for Lincoln conversation. We are proud to host this series of live virtual programs featuring a variety of topics surrounding the life and times of Abraham Lincoln. Tonight's show, Lincoln's Last Train Ride, is number 7 in our 2021 lineup. For more information about upcoming Looking for Lincoln conversations, visit the Looking for Lincoln website at lookingforlincoln.org. You're in for a treat tonight. Let me now introduce to you Chris Vallillo. Chris, take it away.
Thanks very much, Sarah. 156 years ago today, the funeral train bearing the remains of Abraham Lincoln left Washington, D.C. An estimated 10,000 souls were in attendance as the train pulled out of that station. It would travel for 13 days all across the nation. Ironically enough, following the very route Lincoln had taken on his trip to Washington just 4 short years before. The trip would cover 1,654 miles, and it would touch the nation like nothing before ever had. Now, tonight we're going to explore the impact of the Lincoln funeral train on 4 different communities in Illinois where it passed through. They say that all along the route, quite literally millions of everyday people like you or I just came out to stand by the tracks and watch the train pass. One of them was a young girl, a girl named Laura Geddes. She was a student at the Illinois School for Teachers in Normal, Illinois. She wrote about this experience in a letter home to her mother, and that letter was saved and passed from generation to generation. And a few years ago, it came to light. And I'd like to share her very words with you this evening. My dear mother, this has been a week long to be remembered at Normal. On Wednesday morning, the funeral train bearing the remains of our lamented president passed through our little village on the way to its final resting place. The station house was draped in mourning, and there were several appropriate mottos. They raised an arch over the track. It was all wreathed in cedar and white plum blossoms, and across it was the motto, "Go to thy rest." The lady students got up a wreath of the most beautiful flowers I ever saw to be placed on the coffin. On a card was written, "Here is a man whose like we shall never see again." The train was to come at 4, and by that time, all Normal and the neighborhood round were there waiting. It was nearly 5 when the first engine came. It is always 10 minutes ahead. It had a life-size picture of the president in front and was draped in mourning. Then the train hove into sight. It stopped at where the roads crossed and the wreath was put on. There was 8 or 10 cars, all covered with black and white. Little flags on each car with black and white streamers, and a large picture of the president on the engine, just like the first engine. The car the coffin was on was almost black and covered with black and white. Mr. Edwards said it was built in Virginia and presented to the president only a few days before he died for it to come to the fair in Chicago in. It was all iron. There was soldiers standing guard both before and at the end. The head of each man was uncovered till the last car passed under the arch. All stood silently watching till the cars wound slowly round the hill, out of sight. Go to thy rest. Now that is one of countless anecdotes, letters, and stories that folks preserved to share the story of the Lincoln funeral train. Now, if we were to head 25 miles south of Normal, we come to another community, Atlanta, Illinois. And to tell us Atlanta's story of the funeral train, here is Bill Thomas, chairman of the Route 66 Ahead Partnership.
Hey, Chris, thank you very much. You know, since this program is titled Lincoln's Last Train Ride, let's begin by remembering Lincoln's farewell speech from the depot in Springfield before he boarded the train for his inauguration in Washington, D.C. It was Monday, February 11th, 1861. Lincoln's remarks that day included these words: "I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington." Approximately 4 years and 4 months later, he would return, but on his funeral train. And on the way, that train passed through Atlanta, Illinois. Our knowledge of the funeral trains passing through town comes from three sources. Primarily, a letter an Atlanta resident, Louisa Hawes, wrote to her brother Henry on May 3rd, 1865, the very day the funeral train passed through town. Also, from childhood recollections of Atlanta natives, Fred Leonard and H.E. Burke, each of whom wrote letters in 1899 that were then printed in Atlanta's newspaper, the Argus. So, let's set the stage for that day in May 1865. Lincoln was very well known in Atlanta. He was in town on multiple occasions. He was friends with local families. Many were fellow Republicans. In other words, the people who gathered to watch his funeral train were his friends, acquaintances, and political supporters. So let's begin by seeing how they prepared for the funeral train. Let's show the funeral train schedule image. First off, they had known for some time when the train would pass through Atlanta, as the funeral train schedule had already been widely published. We learned from Louisa's May 3rd letter what they did on May 1st and on May 2nd, the days leading up to the train's arrival, to prepare the town and themselves to receive the president's funeral train. Louisa writes, "The people of this place had a meeting Monday evening, May 1st, to make arrangements to receive the train. So yesterday, Tuesday, they went to work. They built an arch over the railroad and trimmed it with black crepe, black muslin, and evergreens. The arch is high enough for the rail cars to pass under. Then they went to work and trimmed the depot the same way. The inscription on one side of the banner that stood alongside of the arch read, 'Slowly and tenderly bear on the dead.' And on the other side, 'Rest in peace.'" From Louisa's letter, we also learn how they prepared themselves. The teacher brought out the school, the children all dressed in mourning. Every child had a flag, and the flags had black crepe tied to their staff. Miss Kegman made a very appropriate banner, on the top of which she put a wreath of evergreens and white flowers, and in the center, a beautiful cross of evergreens. 6 little girls carried this banner. Allie and Ida were 2 of them. These little girls wore white dresses and white ribbon bows on their shoulders. I cannot describe everything, or even half of it. Tuesday, May 2nd, Atlanta's residents probably went to bed early, knowing they'd have to be up before dawn the next day. Let's show the Lincoln funeral train image. The train they rose so early to see had 9 cars, including a baggage car, a hearse car, and the president's car. And on the front of the engine itself, just below the large headlight, was a portrait of President Lincoln in a 5-foot oval frame. Let's show the Atlanta depot image. From Louisa's firsthand account, as well as the later recollections of the 2 men who were in the group of gathered school children, we learn about the scene on that early May morning. Louisa writes, "Bells tolled, the muffled drums played, and everything seemed to say, 'Come and mourn with me.' Even the angels in heaven must surely shed tears of grief, if it be possible, when they look down and see the terrible agony of this beloved nation." On May 3rd, 1865, the sun rose at 5:42 a.m. The funeral train was a bit behind its published schedule. It arrived in Atlanta just as dawn was breaking. It would have been a beautiful spring morning, except for the circumstances of the day. In 1899, Fred Leonard, in his letter, recalled, "All the school children, big and little, were marshaled out at early dawn and met at the schoolhouse, then marched down to the train. A large arch had been built over the track. All of the school that could be were crowded onto the platform, with little ones in front and so on back to the larger ones. I, being a little chap, was on the front row, and when the train came along, I could see right into the car, see the casket and flowers, and several cabinet officers. All of us wore black sashes, and each had a little flag trimmed with black. His fellow schoolmate, H.E. Burke, also wrote, "I was on the depot platform with the other school children, saw the coffin in which he lay, and the guard of blue-coated soldiers, and General Grant and Sherman on the platform on the rear car." You know, a large number of Atlanta's residents were surely on hand that Wednesday morning, but there were also some who probably chose not to attend. President Lincoln and the war effort were not universally supported, even in his home state of Illinois. Anti-activists were referred to at the time as Copperheads. Let's show the Copperhead image. We gain a glimpse of those who resisted the war and Lincoln's policies from an event that happened in Atlanta on April 15th, 1865, the very day Lincoln died. H.E. Burke, that same school child on hand when the funeral train went through town, later recalled for an article written in the town's newspaper. On the day Lincoln died, a large man who lived south of town went out into the streets of Atlanta saying, "It's a good thing he was killed. Should have been done long ago." People grew upset and tried to mob him. I remember they had to surround him, and he was riding on his horse with a revolver in hand, daring anyone to take him. Just as he passed where I was, a policeman ran in behind him, spooked his horse, which jumped, and he fell to the ground. A few of the strong men of town ran into the crowd and saved him from being hung. The next day, they drummed him out of town, made him carry the flag and cheer for Lincoln. As I remember, he was one of the despised breed at that time called Copperheads. Louisa Hawes also references Northern Copperheads in her letter of May 3rd. "Oh, Henry, words fail me when I undertake to describe this mournful scene or the anguish of our hearts while we looked on this mournful procession and thought, who had been the cause of all this? The hellish demon slavery, and the last but not the least, Northern Copperheads." But again, it's unlikely there were any Copperheads on hand that morning of May 3rd, when just as the sun was coming up, the funeral train slowed, but didn't actually stop as it passed through Atlanta. Louisa continues writing, "Henry, I wish you could have been here when the train came up. Then, oh, then how our hearts did ache within us at the sight. The cars were all heavily draped in mourning, and Lincoln's likeness, almost as large as life, there on the front of the engine. It was all over in a matter of moments. As the train picked up speed and moved on towards its eventual destination in Springfield, tragically proving Lincoln right when he speculated some 4 years earlier that he knew not or whether ever he might return." In true small-town fashion, Louisa finished her letter to Henry with a bit of hometown news. Betty Albion was buried yesterday. She died of consumption. Ben Summer is dead. He too was buried yesterday. We are all well. We received 2 letters from you and feel very thankful your life has been spared. I will stop now. Goodbye, Louisa. But then, before mailing the letter, she adds a final line later in the day, noting how those in Atlanta could hear the funeral event some 50 miles away in Springfield when she writes, "Dear brother, we can hear the cannons tolling now in Springfield. How sad, how sad." As the funeral train passed out of Atlanta, a sad mood must have indeed been present. People would have left the depot downtown and headed back to their homes and their regular business of the day. Some of them were probably wearing specially made mourning ribbons. Let's show the mourning ribbon image, such as this one, which was kept over the years and ultimately ended up in the Abraham Lincoln collection at the Atlanta Museum, where it now serves as a reminder of Lincoln's last train ride. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Bill. That was a wonderful story. Now, if any of you folks listening in have questions for any of our guests tonight, go ahead and type them into the chat. And at the end of the show, we'll do a question and answer session, and I'll ask as many as we have time for. Now, moving farther, another 10 miles south, we come to the only town that was named after Abraham Lincoln during his lifetime, Lincoln, Illinois. And to tell us that community story, here is Ron Keller, Associate Professor of History and Politics at Lincoln College.
Good evening, Chris. Good to be with you. And before I discuss the funeral train passing through the city of Lincoln on its way to Springfield in May of 1865, I think it's beneficial to acknowledge the unique connection and kinship that the residents of this community had for their beloved Abraham Lincoln well before the assassination. Before I do, I certainly don't want to assume that somehow the death of Abraham Lincoln was more meaningful to our residents in the city of Lincoln than any other place. But this city was his namesake, named for him and named by him and christened by him in 1853. So indeed, there was a special connection, not just even to Abraham Lincoln, but to the railroad, because the city of Lincoln was birthed because of the railroad coming through. So this is the same railroad, the same stop that Lincoln stopped at on his way to Springfield on the funeral train. So in many ways, Lincoln gave birth to the city, and then he said farewell to the city on the way to Springfield to his final resting place. This is also the same depot, and if we could show the depot on the screen, the depot was constructed shortly after the city was christened in 1853, and it was used until about 1911. This is the same depot again that the train stopped in 1865. But it's also the same train in which Lincoln got off of in 1858 when he gave a famous rally in October of that year during the midst of the Stephen Douglas Abraham Lincoln Senate race. He came here, 5,000 people showed up, and he disembarked from that train, walked downtown from that same depot. He argued many cases here in Lincoln, again, getting off the train at that same depot. And he said a farewell address to the residents of the city of Lincoln, very much like what he did from the back of the train in Springfield. He also did here in Lincoln. And we have the words that he had said in 1861 from the back of the train, from that same railroad, from that same depot. So it was only fitting, I think, that the citizens here would feel the need to pay their deepest respects and to mourn heavily the loss of Abraham Lincoln at that depot on May 3rd of 1865. So as Bill relayed to us, the train came through Logan County, very much like in Atlanta. The same sort of reception was given here in Lincoln, and with many other communities along the route from Washington, D.C. to Springfield. It was stopped or either slowed to allow mourners to pay their respects. And the citizens of these communities pooled their resources together. They pooled their time together. They pooled their talents together to make this a commemoration worthy of the greatest president who probably in their opinions had ever lived. So here in Lincoln, a committee was formed and planned and organized, and they produced a bulletin, which I think we can share on the screen there. And this was the announcement of that the funeral committee had relayed to the citizens of Lincoln in advance of the funeral train coming through. It reads the following. Funeral obsequies of the late president at Lincoln. The undersigned committee appointed by the Common Council of the City of Lincoln to make such arrangements on the occasion of the passage of the remains of our late president through the city as may be fitting and proper, beg leave to announce that the funeral cortege is expected to arrive in the city on Wednesday, May 3rd at 5 a.m. And it is hoped that the train will stop for a few minutes at the depot. The citizens are requested to assemble at the depot at that hour to pay becoming honors to the illustrious dead. Then the bulletin continues. It says the church bells will ring from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock and toll from the time the train arrives in sight until it passes out of sight. A funeral arch will be erected at the depot, and the arch and depot building will be draped in mourning. A funeral dirge will be sung while the train is standing by a choir of ladies and gentlemen. It is earnestly hoped that the attendance on the occasion will be general. And I do find it fascinating that twice in that one bulletin, they specifically request attendance at the depot. So I think that they have a strong urge that we need to pay honor to this man as the train passes through. And Bill has showed a funeral train schedule, and we can show another one. This is very similar to what Bill showed. And many states had these funeral train schedules that would be posted that would show the stop in every city, or at least pass through that state. This, again, like the one Bill showed, is from Chicago to Springfield. The funeral train was supposed to stop at 5 a.m., but trains are notoriously late. It stopped apparently about 7 a.m. in Lincoln. And the Lincoln Heritage Museum has this funeral train schedule. And it says at the top, the purpose of it is to accommodate the citizens along the line as they desire to participate. The scene which greeted the body of Abraham Lincoln in the city of Lincoln, Illinois, was apparently so worthy enough that the largest newspaper of the day, the New York Herald, even printed a story the following day about the funeral train in the city of Lincoln, Illinois. And it reads the following, quote, "Lincoln, Illinois contains between 2,000 and 3,000 inhabitants. Lincoln had a direct interest in its origin. The depot is handsomely draped. Ladies dressed in white and black are singing as we pass under a handsomely constructed arch. On each side of it, which is a picture of the deceased president with a motto, with malice towards none and charity for all. The national and state flags are prominently displayed, and a profusion of evergreens with black and white drapings make up the artistic and appropriate arrangements." And we can show the next picture here, which is from a Lloyd Ostendorf painting, which was colorized, and you can see exactly what the Lincoln Herald described. And similarly, the Chicago Tribune also described the scene, which you see on your screen. It's the Chicago Tribune reported the following: "The town was named for Abraham Lincoln by some of his personal friends before he was even known to be famous. The depot was appropriately draped in mourning, and the ladies dressed in white, trimmed in black, sang a requiem as the train passed under a handsomely constructed arch, on each column of which was a portrait of the deceased president with a motto, with malice towards none and charity towards all, the national colors prominently displayed with artistic decorations." Simultaneous to the last days of the Civil War and the assassination and the burial of Abraham Lincoln was the beginning of Lincoln College, then known as Lincoln University, here in the city of Lincoln. Ground was broken for the first building, which was University Hall, on February 12th, 1865, which was Lincoln's last living birthday. So construction was well underway by the time the funeral train comes through in April of 1865. And we can show on the screen a diary. George H. Gale was the architect and builder of University Hall, and he kept a building diary, and it reported in his diary only two events, other than the entire building diary. It's only two events mentioned. One is about the death of Lincoln on April 15th and the burial on May 4th. He gave his workers the day off on May 3rd, and apparently as well a date on May 4th, so he could attend the ceremonies in Springfield, and his workers could attend the ceremonies in Lincoln on May 3rd. And it reported a great crowd of people in town. The final item I want to talk about, and the final picture I want to show, is perhaps one of my favorite items and artifacts that deal with the assassination. This comes from the Lincoln Heritage Museum. It's a pair of gloves worn by a pallbearer who accompanied the funeral cortege as it proceeded through the city of Lincoln. The gloves are again, part of the collection of Abraham Lincoln. And I think that these are very meaningful to me for several reasons. One, because I had the fortune and honor in 2005 of being an honorary pallbearer when the very moving recreation of the funeral procession happened in Springfield, and to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the funeral. But these gloves also represent something more important. I think it represents the humanity of the tragedy. I mean, these gloves were worn by someone who probably knew Lincoln, who had shaken his hand, who had slapped him on the back of the shoulder in a joke, and who wiped away tears of grief. These gloves make it very personal and very human what these people went through when they mourned Abraham Lincoln. So in conclusion, Lincoln, Illinois, here the citizens produced a very fitting and moving tribute to a man who wasn't just their president, but he was their namesake and their friend.
Thanks very much, Ron. Lincoln's funeral train would end its long, sad journey in Springfield, Illinois, his hometown. His body would lie in state in Representatives Hall in the old state capitol and would be interned on May the 4th in Oak Ridge Cemetery. To share the Springfield portion of our story, here is Justin Blandford, Superintendent of the State Historic Sites in Springfield, coming to us from that very room in the old state capitol, Representatives Hall.
Well, thank you. It's our pleasure to join you this evening from the old state capitol in the capital city of Illinois, Springfield, in Representative Hall. And it is in this place where the final funeral following the train ride that returned Lincoln's body to Illinois from Washington, D.C., was held from May 3rd to May 4th. For this particular segment of the program, I thought I would focus in on a few first-person accounts and a few of the most iconic items that captured people's minds and attentions and hearts as they were mourning the loss of the 16th president. So we'll begin with what is said to be one of the most attention-attracting items during the Springfield period of the funeral train ride, which would be the hearse that was loaned from the city of St. Louis to Springfield for this occasion. And the hearse was utilized in order to transport Lincoln's body from the train to the State House, and then to transport Lincoln's body the following day after the visitation had closed in Representative Hall to Oak Ridge Cemetery, approximately a 2-mile journey on the second portion of its service. The Journal, the Springfield paper of May 5th, 1865, gives this account. So while we view the historic image of the hearse, we can take in these elaborate details and try to understand more of the importance of the hearse, not only its function, but the beauty and the prestige that the hearse lent to this very important task, logistically and in a larger sense, the task of mourning the loss of the president. So again, from the Journal, May 5th, 1865. The hearse used on this occasion is the same used to convey the remains from the depot to the Capitol on Wednesday. It is probably the most beautifully designed and finished carriage of the kind in the Western country. The body is black, oblong in shape. The sides are relieved by silver bands, giving it the appearance of panel work. From this body springs silver pillars with gold base and capitals, and on the tops of each are representations of flames. The spaces between these pillars are filled with heavy plate glass. Around the top of each is figured work in gold. Around the top of the carriage runs ornaments of scroll work of the color of gold. The doors in the rear are of plate glass with figures of a tomb wrought in silver. Each pillar is surmounted with a heavy bunch of black ostrich feathers, between which are eagles draped in black. The lanterns are silver-plated and of the unusual form. The hearse containing the remains was drawn by 6 superb black horses, richly draped and bearing upon their crests bunches of ostrich plumes. We have never seen a better or more elegant hearse in all of its appointments. The spirit which led the mayor of St. Louis to tender so beautiful a carriage for the obsequies is highly credible to his feelings and judgment. Journal, May 5, 1865. The carriage would have stood out to many individuals in Springfield, but it wasn't alone in the items that were heavily adorned with black. For Lincoln's home and many local buildings were draped in black, and for 10 days, individuals worked to appropriately adorn in black the State House, where Lincoln had worked for so many years. First, having worked as a legislator being among the first to work in the very room where I'm standing, the room that would receive his body on May 3rd. It's estimated that approximately 7,000 individuals per hour moved through the State House in mourning, paying their final respects in Representative Hall to the fallen president. Seeing the room in person was obviously a very memorable moment for many individuals, but burning it into the memories of many were small phrases that adorned the upper levels of the frieze behind me here in Representative Hall, in the back and on the sides of the very famous painting of George Washington that still hangs in the center of the room today. On the left side of the painting were inscribed the words, Washington the Father. And on the right side of the painting, and of course the right side of Lincoln's casket, were the words, Lincoln the Savior. And behind me, along the half circle above the gallery, that space was saved for a phrase from Lincoln's own words that he utilized in Independence Hall on the train ride to Washington, D.C., as he was attempting to convey the importance of the principles of national unity. He said to the audience gathered in Independence Hall in what appeared to be impromptu fashion, sooner than surrender these principles, I would be assassinated on the spot. Those words, along with the large catafalque that had been erected to hold the casket that was open during the 24-hour period, made for a memorable, sad, and momentous occasion as the nation continued to mourn and watch the president's body move more closely to its burial. As I said, the hearse was used again to transport Lincoln's body 2 miles. 8 divisions had been identified very carefully by the organizers of the procession to follow Lincoln's hearse out to Oak Ridge Cemetery, where a public receiving vault had been selected. It's important, I think, as we discuss all of the planning, that there was quite a bit of discussion between Lincoln's friends and the Lincoln family regarding where Lincoln's body would be buried. And it was decided by the family, and eventually supported by many of Lincoln's friends, that Oak Ridge Cemetery would be the site, chosen over a lot that had been identified by Lincoln's friends in the downtown that's commonly referred to as the Mather Lot. So here in this country cemetery, along a ridge in a public receiving vault, the hearse arrived after a drive after the 10 o'clock closing of the State House. Oak Ridge Cemetery's public receiving vault, which is located at the bottom of a rise on which Lincoln's tomb now stands, is significant as the scene of the May 4th burial service of Abraham Lincoln. The president's remains rested here until their removal on December 24th of 1865 to a specially constructed temporary tomb. In April of 1864, Oak Ridge Cemetery's Board of Managers ordered a construction of a public receiving vault, quote, the cost not to exceed $500, dimensions 15 by 18 feet with a stone front. The vault's purpose was neatly laid out that fall in regulations for its use, quote, a receiving tomb is provided at the cemetery for the accommodations of those who intend to purchase lots. This tomb has been newly built and will not only be an ornament to the grounds, but quite an accommodation to those who, in their bereavement, are not immediately prepared to site a lot for the final resting place. Also to those who are awaiting the arrival of friends or wish the removal of the dead. And so the Lincoln family needs, certainly fell into this category. And it quickly became the decision that Lincoln's body, along with his son's body, would rest here until a temporary vault could be constructed. It's interesting to note that the vault was very quickly undergoing transformation. Stone from Illinois was quarried and brought in to create retaining walls along the side. And more changes were made before Lincoln's body and his son's bodies were removed. When you visit the receiving vault, which still sits at the bottom of the hill today, you can note that additional changes have been made, and we take great care in its preservation. And it received quite an extensive preservation project just a few years ago before the anniversary. As we move on in the program, next slide, please. I think it's important to understand the ongoing nature of the burial of Abraham Lincoln. And it wouldn't be until October 15th of 1874 when U.S. Grant visited for the dedication of the Lincoln tomb that the tomb would be formally dedicated. And even at that time, the tomb did not include the final military groups that we now recognize as such an integral part of the burial place today. But on that day, October 15th, 1874, the statue that rests on the highest platform of the tomb at the bottom of the obelisk was dedicated. And here we see a copy of the remarks that former President Grant gave that day. And his quote near the end, I think, is quite fitting and touching. He said, "In his death, the nation lost its greatest hero." And hundreds of thousands continue to visit Springfield to pay their respects still today to the Lincoln Tomb. We'll switch to the next slide. And we see that statue that President Grant dedicated in October of 1874. What I think is important that we take with us, although we're discussing Lincoln's last train ride in this program, in many ways, the train that carries us all together as a nation is one that we are still reviewing, one that we are still boarding, and one that we are still encouraging on. And this statue that sits atop the highest platform at the bottom of the obelisk, I think really brings the most encouragement and hope to us as we remember that Larkin Mead, the winner of the contest for the design of the Lincoln Monument and Burial Place, thought to include and was extremely certain that the Emancipation Proclamation was the document that Lincoln should be holding outstretched in his hand for all of us to be guided by. So in a time when obviously there is still great interest in the Lincoln funeral and in the Lincoln legacy, obviously, I think it's important that we consider what that final monument that Grant dedicated in 1874 is to be speaking to us today. And not only did Larkin Mead, but many, many others wanted to give us the message of the importance of the emancipation. And obviously, as the soldier groups would be added finally in the late 1870s to the monument, that when we approach the final resting place of Abraham Lincoln, we not only remember the commander-in-chief, but we also honor the soldiers. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Justin. Well, we'll be opening up the conversation to your questions for any of our guests here in just a minute. So this would be a good time to go ahead and write them into the chat. While you're doing that, I want to wind up this portion of our program with a song that tells the story of Lincoln's last train ride, written by Norman Blake, Lincoln's Funeral Train. On the 21st of April, 1865, 3:31 left Washington for Lincoln's last train ride. Cannons boom, bonfires burn the evergreen war crate. 3:31 in the morning sun did her sad journey make. See that train coming, boys, rolling down the main. Draped in black, she won't be back. It's Lincoln's funeral train. where the portrait of the martyred man shot down by a traitor now toll the bell and bid farewell to the great emancipator. And on the locomotive's front is picture adorning, in the oil lamps gleaming yellow light, rumbling on till morning. The engine Nashville number 15 with her black flags flying ran from Cleveland to Springfield past the mourners crying. See that train coming, boys, rolling down the main. Draped in black, she won't be back. It's Lincoln's funeral train, where the portrait of the martyred man shot down by a traitor now toll the bell and bid farewell to the great emancipator. Crowds jammed the streets for a final look at the great man who had stood at the country's helm through the bitter war that seemed of little good. Felled by the bullet of John Wilkes Booth as the battle died away, his guiding spirit to reconcile by absence brought dismay. See that train coming, boys, rolling down the main. Draped in black, she won't be back. It's Lincoln's funeral train, where the portrait of the martyred man shot down by a traitor now toll the bell and bid farewell to the great emancipator. Now toll the bell and bid farewell to the great emancipator. Lincoln's Funeral Train by Norman Blake. Well, let's bring everybody back onto the screen, and we'll start to have our conversation about the funeral train. Well, first of all, let me tell all of you how moving these stories are. There's this big sense almost of a commonality that I'm hearing in every one of these locations. And I know, Justin, you sort of touched on this initially, but if I can get every one of you, perhaps starting with Bill and moving down the line, to give me your thoughts as to why is it important that we study Lincoln's funeral train today?
Because you're going to ask us a quiz later? Is that why, Chris? No, it's important because I think the first thing that pops into my mind is just think about how much that event, even though it was a tragedy, united the country for a brief time. And given current circumstances, if ever we needed to be united, this is certainly a time, and that offers an example. We wouldn't want another tragedy like that, but it does demonstrate that we can be united. So that's my initial thought.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Ron, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I guess I would say something similar to Bill. You know, after 4 years of a bloody, divisive civil war, we have a moment of unity, albeit tragic and horrific, but it did show how a nation could come together. And I guess what really strikes me when I thought a lot about this when I studied the funeral train, is how many people really were in attendance. I mean, I've seen estimates of a million and people who visited the various sites, on another 6 or 7 million who were along the funeral train route. That's about 8 million people. The population of the country in 1865 was 31 million. That's a quarter of the people in the entire country turned out to witness this event. They understand how significant this is in their lifetime. And I think so that, historically speaking, makes it only more important that we look back and see how significant this man what he meant to the people, that they would have that much of an effort to witness this, to pay money to have these great lavish commemorations in their cities. Very, very meaningful.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
I
Justin,
think
any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think to build on what Ron was saying, that depth of meaning is really important to us as a country, and I think it's worth studying as we continue to mourn our modern challenges throughout this country, and as we face new challenges, that we prepare ourselves by studying what those who came before us did as they faced what they felt were the most monumental challenges of their lives. The tinsmith who was brought in after the doors closed at 9 a.m. on May 4th into this very room, the tinsmith who sealed Lincoln's casket for what many thought would be the final viewing. Essentially, he was the last person to see Lincoln's face during that whole funeral movement before his body was removed out to Oak Ridge Cemetery. His name was Samuel Elder. And the tools that he used, that he relied upon to make a living, were never used again. He could not pick them up again and use them to make a living because of what he drew on them for on that day. And I think that's one of the stories that sticks with me, and it really answers that question. Why? Why do we want to come back and learn about those tremendous accounts from Atlanta, and to hear about the pride of the citizens of Lincoln, and to learn what a workman did that day on May 4th, 1865, in this very room in Springfield? Because I believe it is in those words and in those stories that we can find hope for our modern challenges and the mourning that we are left here to go through.
Yeah, in many ways, I kind of wonder, there's a sense of commonality with all of these stories. And I'm wondering if it didn't prove to be one of those points where the country begins to become the nation we know today. We share this massive experience of grief and loss. And through it, we become closer to one another, perhaps. I did have a couple of questions here from some of our audience members. We had someone asking, do we happen to know how many stops the train actually made on its journey? I know it was a long trip, so. Anybody have an idea?
No, I mean, obviously it was 20 days, and the problem, and I think Bill actually talked about this when you were talking about that sometimes the train slowed rather than stopped.
Right.
Because, and so I don't want to have a definitive answer on that, but obviously it would slow down, and the train never went more than about, 20 or 25 miles per hour the entire trip. And it would slow down to about 5 miles per hour. And even in Lincoln, I hear the train stopping, but, however brief that would have been, and before they had to move on, because they had a timetable to keep. And I think the train itself, when it came to Springfield, and Justin, you can maybe you can confirm or deny this, but I think the train was only about an hour late from the original schedule that they had. So they couldn't have stopped too long or drug that out too long, because they would have gotten the whole schedule off kilter.
Yeah, that would make sense to me as well. Someone wanted to know, I believe, Justin, you mentioned that there was another plot in Springfield that they were considering, and they ultimately went with Oak Ridge. They were curious as to where that place was.
Yeah, locally, I can't pick a landmark, but it would be on the western edge of Springfield, and it's referred to as the Mather Lot. If they want to direct message me, Chris, we can dig that up, and then I can find a landmark that would be common to that today, and we can point them in that direction. So just reach out to us here at the Old State Capitol following the show, and we'll be glad to identify that for you as best we can. And I don't think that'll be hard. I just don't have that at my fingertips right now. But it was referred to at the time as the Mathers Lot, and that was the place that Lincoln's friends were heavily advocating for, causing quite a bit of a disagreement, actually, in the days leading up to the funeral.
And of course, I would expect that the western edge of Springfield is a lot closer to downtown now than the modern day edge is. Yeah, but that would be an interesting. So we had a question that someone wanted to know if you could address the fact that Willie also was transported on the funeral train and would later be interred with his father. Perhaps some additional information on that from whoever feels competent.
I do know Willie's body was interned in the receiving vault with Lincoln's as well. Now, there are fewer details about Willie's body in terms of the old state capitol. I just don't have those, but the receiving vault was used for both.
And I think that was at the strong request of Mary Lincoln that the body be brought back to join the family. And I think that was, I'm assuming that was definitely her wishes, maybe others, but I know that she protested that happened for sure.
Yeah. So I had someone ask if you would repeat the combination of the two populations. I think, I don't know if it was Ron who said that, the number of people who viewed the body in its transport versus the population of the nation.
So I had read before that perhaps about a million people viewed the funeral casket when it was on display in several of the cities. That's from Washington, D.C. all the way to Springfield, and another 6 to 7 million people. And these are all estimates, because obviously we don't know. Nobody took a head count at every town. So these are total estimates. So I'm not sure how accurate we want to go with that, but several historical accounts say another 6 to 7 million. And there were about 31 million people as the U.S. Census population in 1865. So again, 20 to 25% of the public. That's just pretty incredible.
That's an amazing number when you think about it. I see a comment here that someone mentions that they believe the lot you referred to is near where Springfield High is located in this day and age. That sounds about in the right ballpark. So I had a question. Someone wants to know, do you agree with the idea that people coming out to see the funeral train in many ways served as a sense of closure for families and the countless families that would have lost loved ones in the war, particularly those that never were able to have their bodies returned? Bill, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's part of that overall shared grief. You're not going to be able to watch that train go by and not think of a loved one who has passed if they were from your family, especially if they were a soldier. So I think that makes a lot of sense, yes.
Yeah, and there were so many soldiers that were lost and not returned that I could see that resonating very deeply with families. I had a question from Donna Ball, who wants to know who constructed Lincoln's coffin. Now, is that something that we have any historical record of in this day and age?
Wow, at my fingertips, I don't know that I have that. Again, we know that Samuel Elder was a tinsmith, and if we don't find it with any assistance from maybe Heather offline before the closure, she would be welcome to contact us afterward, and we could try to find that out. There is a surprising number of details about some of the different individuals involved, but that's not a name that I've seen assigned to that particular item, the coffin.
Mm-hmm. I was privileged to be able to see the recreation of the funeral train car when it was being built. I actually was brought up to Elgin, Illinois, to see it under construction, and it was a pretty remarkable experience. They were just beginning to put the siding on it, and the wheels were attached, and I was not able to come into Springfield to see the recreation, but I'd be curious to get everybody's feelings about the celebration of the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's passing and funeral train. Ron, why don't we start with you on that one?
Well, I think I mentioned this when in my my talk earlier that I was very fortunate to be honored to be an honorary pallbearer for that event, and it's one of those events I'll never forget. And I think what struck me about this, and kudos to a lot of people who pulled time and resources together. And Katie Spindell, definitely one of those people who led this mission and did it very, very well. And I tell you what, I mean, that day, I mean, there were people from all over the world who came to Springfield, and it was almost like, in one hand, I had to say to myself, do you people all realize this guy died 150 years ago? He's dead. It's not a real funeral. But the seriousness they were taking it, and there were so many times that people were weeping. I mean, literally just bawling. Yeah. Particularly when it hit the Springfield home, I'll never forget, because I'll never look at the Lincoln's home in Springfield the same again, because that's where it stopped. You know, when we stopped for a few minutes, it was quiet. I mean, 1,000 people gathered around in absolute quiet. So much respect that they were paying to him. And I mean, I choked up at that time thinking, man, this is meaningful. This is impactful. And then it hit me again when we go right into the cemetery at their Oak Ridge. And wow, these throngs of people just waiting. So just incredible commemoration.
Yeah. I have somebody has added a little information about the coffin. I'll share this with everyone. Jane Ford tells us his coffin was constructed of solid walnut, lined with lead, and completely covered in expensive black cloth. Mm-hmm. It was 6 feet 6 inches long and was decorated with sterling silver handles and sterling silver studs extending the entire length of its sides. Mm. Pretty impressive, wow. I'm sure. Now,
just a quick note about the commemoration. Again, I want to echo Ron's comments. It was such a tremendous illustration of grassroots planning, and again, acknowledging the role, especially of Katie Spindell, who just did so much, and the many reenactors who traveled to our cities to be a part of that and to volunteer their time and their resources. That was just such a tremendous outpouring that I'll remember it for a long time, for those illustrations of that just tremendous commitment to the Lincoln legacy. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that the hearse was recreated, built by veterans through the financing, the support, the philanthropy of the Staub family in Springfield. And so that is something that people can still connect with because that is in the Springfield community and is brought out from time to time. So I think the generosity and the philanthropy that grew out of that occasion that allowed for such an important artifact to be recreated was very, very special, in addition to the tremendous volunteer effort.
Yeah, I actually had an opportunity to view the hearse. It was at the Illinois State Fair for a time period, and it was very, very striking. And even in that context, there was a sense of dignity about it. People might be talking 20 feet away, but if they approached the hearse, they were respectful and silent. Pretty striking.
Chris, and everybody, just think for a moment what it says about the position in which we hold Lincoln. Yeah. Think about how we celebrate and commemorate all of our other presidents. But in his case, we actually recreated his funeral. That's the regard in which he's held. I think that's pretty amazing.
Well, that and as Justin was mentioning, the impact that it had in real time. I can't imagine that happening with any other historical figure.
No.
I've kind of often thought that in many ways, the story of Lincoln is the story of America. You know, a self-made man who comes out of the Western wilderness and becomes a leader that literally carries the nation through our darkest hour, our greatest trial by fire, the Civil War, and brings us through to a new age. To me, that's just an incredibly potent story.
And not a black and white individual, a person who was extremely complicated and had differing views that evolved over time, which says a lot about the country also, if you really look at it and study its history.
I love the fact that Lincoln's thinking evolves as his understanding changes, his thinking evolves, which is so rare and so brilliant a concept. You know, let me see. I need to jump back. I had a couple of real quick questions back here that are. I know someone was asking about the story of how vandals broke into the Lincoln Vault. That's fairly well known, but Justin, could you perhaps touch on that one a bit?
Sure. So in 1876, not long after the dedication by President Grant, individuals, counterfeiters, part of a counterfeiting gang, attempted to steal Lincoln's body. And thankfully, the Secret Service had infiltrated that gang, and they were aware. So the act never transpired. And I think that's really important to point out. You know, there's a lot of misses in history, and someone might only catch the back half of a television show or a history program and walk away with the, thinking that someone actually stole Lincoln's body. And we try to correct a lot of those misunderstandings when people visit the tomb. But it was an attempt that was made in 1876, and they were not successful, as you might expect of a group creating such a scheme. Not very bright, and thankfully not successful.
And I would have to throw in a little bit of our local history in that plot began to be unraveled here in Lincoln when some loose lips with a little bit of alcohol apparently were overheard, led to this conversation being overheard, which then led to this whole plot, as Justin said, being unraveled.
Yeah.
And by the way, that where that happened was only about a block from our depot.
Wow.
So.
Now, someone asked if Lincoln's tomb is still open. I know that it is, but you need to make reservations. Justin, could you give them a little information about that?
Right. Yes, it is open 7 days a week from 9 to 4 currently during the pandemic. And you can visit our website, Springfield Historic Sites at IDNR, and you'll have the opportunity to connect in, or you can just go directly to Eventbrite if you want to make your reservation. If you can't make a reservation, we will also help you with that on site. So don't get too stressed out about the reservation part, but it's part of the protocol of the public health guidance that everyone is reserved in a space at least before they enter the tomb. And we're delighted to also be starting this year a series of walk, hike, bike history programs. And we have several hikes that are taking place on a weekly basis through September that actually explore into Oak Ridge Cemetery. There's a Friends of Lincoln hike, a Black History hike, and a military history hike. So we hope people will check that out and put a visit to the Lincoln Tomb on their calendar this summer and fall.
Yes, indeed. And while you're doing that, be sure to stop in Atlanta and see the museum there. Bill, I know you have an extensive Lincoln collection there. You want to give us a couple of sentences about that here as we're getting close to winding up?
Sure. It is a very interesting collection because it's presented and interpreted primarily through the eyes of the people that knew Lincoln and his many times here in the community. So.
Yes, indeed. So Ron, I know that there is a Lincoln Museum in Lincoln, and I believe it's associated with Lincoln College. You want to give us a little bit about that?
And I'll try to keep it, I like to sell that museum, so I'll try to keep this short. But in fact, I used to be director of this museum, Lincoln Heritage Museum, on our college campus. Lincoln Heritage Museum is open 9 to 4, Monday through Friday, 1 to 4 on Saturdays. And we actually have a very interactive exhibit upstairs, which actually starts in Ford's Theater and goes through Lincoln's life. When as the approach we take is that Lincoln's going through his life. Between the time he's shot and the time he dies, he's going through a life review. I guess I'll say it that way. And he's remembering his life. But downstairs, we have a lot of Abraham Lincoln related items, Civil War items, some really interesting pieces. So definitely worth a visit there.
All right. Well, let's wind up with just one last question. I'll ask all of you to respond in some way. And I know we've touched on it briefly in different parts of our conversation tonight. But why is it important that we still continue to study the life and death of Abraham Lincoln? Let's go and start off with Atlanta first and move down through our geographical timeline.
Chris, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say it all, but I think he's the president that we all can learn the most from. Consider the circumstances of his administration and the challenges it was facing. You want to learn from those that are in the thick of the worst of it. And I don't know if there's ever been a worse time in the country than the Civil War. So we have to remember him because he got us through that experience.
Absolutely. Ron, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's similar to what we said before. I think in a very divisive time that we're living in politically, it behooves us to look back to Abraham Lincoln, who's who implored people to seek the better angels of their nature,
Yeah.
right? Who was someone who never, I mean, he hated slavery, but he basically told Southerners, I understand you. I would do the same thing if I were you. I mean, someone who tried to understand the other side rather than demonize them. We need more of that in our politics, in our culture, in our business, in our society. So to me, it wasn't just Lincoln's presidency and what his accomplishments, it was his character and how he led, how he lived, and that's what we need to study. That's why he's important.
Yeah. Justin, you get the last word.
Well, I think Lincoln gave us a vision of emancipation, and that is a process that we are still working through as a country today. And it's important to look back to the person who created that vision and the people who helped Lincoln create that. Today we're celebrating new findings about the archaeology related to Harriet Tubman, and I think in recent years have done a tremendous job of focusing attention on Frederick Douglass and the role that he played in guiding Lincoln's vision for emancipation. And so I think it's really important as our country continues to move forward in leadership and in our democracy, that we look back to the architect of that democracy and the people he worked with that gave us so much to work with, and that we continue to work hard at understanding and fulfilling the vision they gave us.
Beautifully said, all of you. I want to thank Bill Thomas, Ron Keller, and Justin Blandford for joining me here for this Lincoln Conversation, Lincoln's Last Train Ride. Special thanks to the Abraham Lincoln National Heritage Area for making this all possible. We'll see you down the road, folks, next time out. Good night, everybody.